Hi guys, this is going to be the video regarding business ethics. We will have finished up talking about paralegal ethics. And right now what I want to talk about is some of the different issues that come up in business ethics. This is a fairly broad topic. And so we're not going to be touching on every single last thing because we could actually have a very extended discussion about this. But I do want to highlight some things that can come up. I'm going to start out with some extreme examples really having to do with some of the big cases that have come up where the ethical issues have gotten so bad that it becomes criminal behavior. Basically, the things get kind of out of control. I want to start out by talking about the case of Enron, having to do with a couple of scandals that arose. One is the Enron Scandal. And this involved a company in Houston. This is back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, that was involved in energy and energy trading. Basically, Enron would buy up different energy companies, everything from oil to electricity. And they were extremely successful. They made a lot of money, especially in the late 1990s. Now, what happened with Enron basically had to do with how they were looking at their profits, okay, their accounting practices. And this is what was going on. When a company is out there selling itself, its stock, they're hoping to get people to invest. That's the idea. You buy stock in a company. Now, the more interest there is in a company, and this is the general rule, the more the price of the stock goes up, okay, and the more the company is worth, because when you want to buy a share, when you want to buy a piece of the company, it gets more and more expensive the more those shares go up in value. And of course, that's the money that the company is bringing in to do things. One of the things that you do if you're deciding whether or not to invest in a particular company is you look at how profitable they are, how successful they are as a company. In the case of Enron, they would publish every year and every quarter, every 3 months, their profits. They would say, look, this is how much money we made this quarter, these last 3 months. And as it was trending upward, you'd say, oh, wow, this company is making money. If I invest right now, and let's say I buy a share for $10 as an example, then maybe in a year or two, that one share that I bought for $10 is now going to be worth $20 or $30 or more, right? The idea is that you'll have made money that way, right? Because you bought at 10 and then you sell, you can get out basically at $20, $30 and you now have made some profit. This was very important for Enron. And what they would do normally is they would report and be very, here's how much money we made. The problem for Enron, though, is that after a time, their profits started to flatten out. They weren't making as much money as they had in previous quarters. Now, that's not unusual. That happens a lot in business. Companies can't be simply, always be making the right deals, always be making money, always be profitable. But Enron's managers had a lot of pressure from the higher ups to show that, in fact, they were going to buck the trend and that they were going to be successful no matter what. So this is what Enron does. Enron, in a nutshell, starts to report currently not how much money it made, but how much money it projected to make. So, for example, let's say for the first 3 months of this year, they made, they broke even. That's unacceptable, right? Enron needs to be making money. They need to be profitable. So what they started to do is they said, well, look, what if instead of just looking at the money we made this 3-month period, we go to the next 3-month period and we report that money as money we made now. Now, notice, this is not money that they've actually made. What they were doing is they were saying, we think we're going to make this much money in the next 3-month period. So we're going to bring it forward and report it to everybody and saying, this is how much money I have. Enron started to do this on a regular basis. And the problem was that every time that they would do this, they would basically use up that future profit. So in other words, if they said for this current reporting period, well, we're going to borrow, right, $1 million worth of profit from the future. Well, once you get to the future, you can't count that $1 million anymore because it's already used up. You used it 3 months ago. So what you wind up having to do is you have to reach out even further into the future. This is what they were doing. When Enron crumbled, which was in the summer of 2001, they were 20 years, they were projecting out 20 years into the future as to how much profit they were making now. This is the equivalent of asking someone that you meet, hi, how much money do you make? And they tell you, I make $200,000. And the reality of it is that right now, they're still in high school. What they're telling you is not how much money they're making now. What they're telling you is, oh, I expect that I'm going to be in high school, I'm going to go to college, I'm going to graduate from college, I'm going to get a great job, I'm going to become the owner of the company, and then I'm going to make $200,000 a year, okay? Enron was doing essentially the same thing. They were projecting out so far in the future that people would think, wow, they're making all this great money. But the reality of it was all built up on lies, on projections. And they weren't telling the investors, they weren't telling the public what was really going on. Now, normally, this you wouldn't be able to do this because of what's called an audit. An independent accounting agency comes in and looks at your books, looks at your figures and says, wait a minute, this isn't right. You can't be doing this. In Enron's case, they had hired Arthur Andersen, which was a very, very esteemed and profitable company that had been doing this for a very long time. The problem became that Arthur Andersen was not just going out and actually doing these audits. Arthur Andersen was also a client of Enron's, and they were making a lot of money based on how to project out and how to present this information. It is the classic wolf guarding the henhouse scenario. And for Enron, it became very profitable for them to be throwing a lot of money at Arthur Andersen because Arthur Andersen's auditors basically played dumb. They hid their eyes and they pretended that they weren't seeing the issues. It got bad enough that Arthur Andersen, even though they were one of the largest accounting firms in the world, wound up also crumbling, collapsing due to this scandal because it was exposed that they too were engaging in unethical behavior. Now, over time, what wound up happening with Enron was they actually wound up seeing some of their CEOs and some of their corporate executives go to prison for this. This is what I'm saying. This is one of those business ethical issues that go beyond just simply unethical behavior, which I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about in a bit. But this was actually something that went all the way into actual criminal behavior. Now, one of the other folks that that we can talk about when we talk about kind of this unethical behavior is having to do with Bernie Madoff. Okay, this again was another very high profile case from a few years ago. Bernie Madoff was basically kind of a guru in investing. He was somebody who would take people's money and invest it, and he engaged in a Ponzi scheme where basically the way Ponzi schemes are, you tell someone, look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of your money and I'm going to invest it, and then after a certain period of time you can withdraw it and you'll have made money. Okay, but you're not really investing it in anything. What you're doing is you're bringing in more people, and as the first investors start to go out, you pay them with the new investors' money. It's also sometimes called a pyramid scheme, okay, where basically you wind up, the way you make money is you bring in more and more new people and pay off the first people with the other people's money. The picture you see right on the screen, that's actually the man, Mr. Ponzi, who was in fact the first person who done this. He did this back in the 1920s. He put together an elaborate scheme. And basically these folks, what they do, and this is Mr. Madoff, he wound up making $18 billion. That's what he stole from investors. He was in New York City. He was known as a guru. This was the guy that you went and you invested your money with because he had great returns. So basically it's like, whatever, you have $1 million, you give it to him, and then in a year's time, he would tell you, hey, look, I doubled your money. Here's $2 million. And you'd be like, oh my God, you're awesome. You're great. Well, the reality of it is he paid you the $1 billion, not because he invested in the stock market or companies or whatever. What Bernie Madoff was doing was he would take your $1 million and then convince 3 other people, 4 other people, 5 other people, 10 other people to invest the money, and it would take that money and then pay you off with it. Okay. Now, what that led to and Bernie Madoff did this very successfully for a while, is that it became very well known. Hey, this guy's just a guru. He's great at investing. He has all these magic secrets. So people would actually be begging to invest their money with him, and he actually would turn people down. That became part of his whole scheme. He became very attractive specifically because he didn't take everyone that wanted to give him their money, and so that's one of those psychological things that can go on in these types of issues, where basically, you want to invest your money specifically because he's exclusive and because he only works with certain clientele. And, he wound up stealing billions of dollars. That's how successful he was. He wound up pleading guilty and wound up receiving a 150-year federal prison sentence when it all came crumbling down. Because that's one of the big problems with these pyramid schemes. Eventually, you get to the point where you're not bringing any more money in, and people are asking to be paid off, and all of a sudden you can't pay them off. Now, a few things to break down. When we're talking about ethics, we're talking about what's right and wrong. Morals are basically principles and values that are applied to social behavior. In business ethics, you're trying to determine what's right and what's wrong. Now, the examples I've used right before this are illegal acts. And obviously, illegal acts are always unethical. Taking money from people and lying to them, okay, saying, if you give me money and I'm going to invest it, when in reality, all you're doing is keeping the money for yourself, that's illegal and unethical. Lying to people about how much profits your company is making, like what Enron did, that's illegal and unethical. Where it gets a little bit harder to figure out the difference is when activity is actually illegal, but is it ethical? So for one example, the one that I've cited here, let's say you have a company that makes a medicine, a drug. They think that the medicine, for example, can help cure morning sickness in pregnant women. They start to test this medicine, and they discover that in a relatively high percentage of cases, the medicine causes birth defects. The FDA in the United States says, you cannot market this medicine. You cannot give this medicine to pregnant women. Yes, it does cure morning sickness, but it has this horrible side effect that makes it dangerous. So the company, which has invested millions of dollars in the development of this drug, is now going to take a huge loss because all of their money gone. They're not going to be able to recoup that money. What about, though, if there is another country, let's say a country in Europe, let's say Bulgaria, and Bulgaria says, you know what, per their rules, that drug can be sold in that country. This brings up the ethical dilemma. The company knows that the drug causes birth defects, but it also knows that in Bulgaria, it would be legal to sell the drug. Should they? This is one of the things that companies struggle with on a daily basis, okay? And frankly, there is no good answer because you can have an argument and a counter argument. Many companies would opt, for example, to say, well, we're not going to do this. This drug just isn't acceptable. We're not going to do this. But believe it or not, if it's not illegal, there would be nothing to stop this company from actually doing it in that other country. It would only be the ethics of it. This is why I'm saying it can be sometimes very difficult to figure out what is right and what is wrong, because there can always be winners and losers in these types of situations. Another thing to consider, the ethical tone in business, okay? First off, ethics is top down, okay? Now, what I mean by this is ethics is always set by the leadership of a company. It is never set by the workers at the bottom. So, for example, let's say that you have a boss who, on their expense report, fudges a little bit. In other words, let's say, for example, that they're on a business trip, and during that business trip, they took a cab to a conference, but in reality, someone else, they shared the cab with someone else, and that person paid the cab. But this person, this executive, decides to nonetheless submit a voucher saying, hey, I paid for this cab trip to and from the conference every morning, 5 days straight, when in reality, every day for those 5 days straight, they shared a cab with someone else who paid. they submit those vouchers. What's been shown, guys, over time is that that kind of behavior will trickle down. It never trickles up. In other words, if a worker, an employee sees that the boss, that the executives, that the higher ups are engaging in this type of unethical behavior, that will open the door for them to do it. You don't ever see it where, oh, a lower level employee, for example, fudged on the vouchers, made claims about, spending some money that they want to be reimbursed for. And then an executive up top says, oh, if that employee can do it, well, then I should be doing it too. And another classic example of this is, for example, drinking alcohol at lunch. Generally it's frowned upon, right? During a business day, right? You go to lunch, let's say you go to a restaurant, generally speaking, you're not going to, if you're with your boss, you're not going to order a beer, even if you want a beer. However, if your boss orders a beer, it opens the door now to saying, maybe if I want a beer, or maybe if I want some kind of alcohol, it's okay, it's acceptable. Again, that's why it's top down. You'll never see an employee show up at a bar or at a restaurant and say, I'm going to order a beer. And then the executive says, well, that's a really good idea. I think I'm going to do that too. This is why it's also important for management to set the tone for employees. Cheating on expense accounts, doing that kind of a thing, it will in fact trickle down and it will become more common. What's good for the goose is good for the gander type. This is also why it's a good idea for companies, especially as they grow and get larger, to establish codes of conduct. These codes of conduct help let people know, look, this is how we're going to do business. For example, if you're going to claim expenses during the trip, you have to get them pre-approved. You can never just show up with a bunch of receipts and say, hey, this is how much I spent, reimburse me. You can't just have a carte blanche to use a credit card, the company credit card, however you want. Instead, there's going to be specific rules about what you can spend it on, how you can spend it on, what time you need to submit reimbursements, that kind of thing. You can also have corporate compliance programs. These can include policies, but also, for example, committees that help set up ethical rules. Like, okay, how should we be dealing with these issues? As problems arise, instead of being reactive, you're proactive. You're trying to figure out what are some of the problems that might come up. Training programs on ethical issues, and I know this can get kind of redundant, but these are kinds of things companies need to think about. Do you want employees to be drinking at lunch hour? If there's no kind of a code of conduct or compliance program, and employees are drinking at lunch all the time, or say drinking at the company party that's taking place on company property in the middle of the afternoon, they'd be justified in saying, well, I didn't know I couldn't drink. I thought that it was fine. But if you set it up in such a way that they understand that it's not allowed, then you're going to be able to head those problems off before they begin. The other issue too is internal audits. Basically, audits are reviews. They can be done internally, and they spot problems. Or, for example, is an office manager overstepping his bounds and making purchases that should be okayed by a higher up? That happens. I've seen that happen where basically they start to make all these purchases because they're the person in control of purse strings. But in reality, they should be getting signatures. They should be getting permission from someone higher up. Audits can really expose these things. And in fact, sometimes they've exposed, as we saw here in El Paso with some of the public corruption cases in the past, people who were engaging in, again, behavior that went from being unethical to illegal. Now, there's always going to be the issue of the ethical trade-offs, the conflicts that exist between the goals that the shareholders have and the employees have. And this is one of those issues that always comes up, for example, in downsizing. Downsizing is when companies have to lay off employees, okay? So take it, for example, a Kmart. Okay, Kmart was a very successful company for a long time, but they fell on hard times and they started laying off employees. There are winners and losers in those scenarios. Ethically speaking, one might say, well, it's wrong to take jobs away from people. It's wrong to fire people that have been loyal to the company. On the other side, a counter argument can be made that, well, wait a minute. There are people who have invested their money into Kmart. And if you don't take the steps necessary to try to keep them in business, those people are going to be hurt because they're, by trying to keep everybody happy, by trying to keep all the employees on board, you're eventually going to wind up losing that kind of a business. And so it's very important to understand there's no good solution. There's no good answer for a lot of these questions. A lot of times what you wind up with is these types of trade-offs. What's interesting about it is ethics can take all sorts of different shapes and sizes. And sometimes the answers are not very clear. You know, if you've invested a lot of time and money in a product, but the product is dangerous and you can't market it in one country, is it okay to use it in a different company? You know, for example, is it okay to try to sell it somewhere else and try to recoup the money for the investors, for the people who actually put money into your company? The answers are not clear cut. You're always going to have arguments one way or the other. However, one of the things that companies always need to be looking at is, should we be setting up committees, trainings, policies to help us address these issues before they arise? Like I said, instead of being reactive, instead of trying to figure out an answer when the problem has already come up, being proactive, so you've already have thought these things out and you already understand, okay, in this scenario, if this drug winds up not being helpful, you know, not being something we can market in the United States because it has horrible side effects, we're not going to sell it anywhere else. Because if it doesn't pass FDA thresholds, it means we're not going to sell it. On the other hand, there may be a more, you know, gray type policy. These are the kinds of things that companies always deal with. I'm going to wrap up this video. In the next video, we'll be talking a little bit about how global issues affect business ethics.